All right, everybody. Hello. Congratulations on having another snow day. Unfortunately for me, this didn't happen to fall on a documentary day again, so I'm making a YouTube lecture. I prefer to do a YouTube lecture as opposed to a Zoom lecture because personally, I feel like it's really hard to pay attention in Zoom class. So hopefully you can choose to watch this video at a time that you're actually going to pay attention. You might notice my cat back here. Say hi, Poppy. Say hi. Hi. Look. Oh, it's okay. See? Look. Oh, okay. Um, she is the naughty one. She's the naughty cat. So she likes to sit back there and attack my hair sometimes and or sneeze giant boogers all over the place. If some tomfoolery and shenanigans occurs during this lecture, you're welcome, I guess. That's a reason to pay attention. So let's go ahead and get right into our lecture. I like to try to keep it relatively short when we are online because it's just not the same. I don't know, it's just not the same, but we're still going to cover all of the material, okay? Alrighty, everybody. So I have like a little green screen situation going on now. I'll put my glasses back on so I don't get a headache. But let's get into it. I think I'm gonna hang out down here for most of the time, and I'll try to like move out of the way as necessary. But today we are going to be talking about labor organization through time and space. So kind of expanding on this idea of cultural relativism and the anthropological mindset as it can apply to a globalized economy and this idea of labor organization that we're covering in this module. So first, I want you to review all of these vocab words. Our first test is coming up, so you definitely need to make sure that you know all of these. And I don't want you to rely on your usual understanding that you already know outside of this class of these terms, because I have a lot of students who do that, especially business students who are like, yeah, I know what capitalism is, I know what neoliberalism is. And they show up to the test, and lo and behold, they get the questions wrong because when we are thinking anthropologically, a lot of the time our definitions are going to be a little bit different. So take a little bit of time to go ahead and find all of these in your notes and make sure that you understand them. The main reason why it's really important that we understand ethnocentrism today is because part of the point of today's lecture is that there's no right or wrong way to organize labor. If we are judging another culture based off of their labor organization because it's different from ours, we are probably being ethnocentric, which means judging another culture by the values of our own. So again, that capitalist neoliberal habitus that we usually have in the United States, where capitalism, a free market, neoliberalism, the Protestant work ethic all just sort of feel like common sense. But we know in this class, anytime something feels like common sense, it's probably really cultural. So today we're going to talk a little bit about uh, how our culture can inform the specific ways that we organize labor, both here and around the world. And hopefully, this offers an opportunity for us to practice resisting ethnocentrism. Okay, so our first new thing that we need to talk about is industrialization. This is mostly just a picture slide, so I'll probably go back and forth with it. But industrialization is defined as the process of transforming the economy of a nation or region from a focus on agriculture to a reliance on manufacturing. When we talk about industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, we're mostly talking about the mid 1700s through the mid 1800s and Europe and the United States, because this is when we started to see all of these machines and manufacturing starting to be on the rise, as opposed to mostly relying on those agricultural jobs. And with this industrialization, capitalism also grew. So we were able to mass produce things. We were able to, oh, it's Poppy. I was trying to let you see the words. It says exporting and profit. But with all of these machines, we were able to do all of that more efficiently, which fed into this capitalist mindset where we're able to produce and we kind of delineate labor from the product. And instead, we are focusing on payment for labor, payment for time. This was a really interesting time. There was a lot of pollution, um, a lot of really long hours. We didn't have the standard 40-hour work week quite yet during this time period. And everybody needed a job, right? If you weren't willing to work the, 60, 80, 100 hours a week, they would just kick you to the curb and the next guy would come in to fill your job. So you really didn't have any choice. The pay was terrible, there were toxic fumes, and the machines were really, really dangerous. Um, so we'll get into all of that in just a second. But first, I want to talk about who is industrialized. So again, to be industrialized just means that we're not relying on agriculture, but rather we are manufacturing and producing objects and selling those or exporting them. So, some industrialized countries, for example, would be the United States, India, Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. And some non-industrialized places might be Bangladesh, Cambodia, Guinea, Sudan, and Yemen. There's some other terms that we use to refer to this definition. So, for example, we might call industrialized countries developed nations and non-industrialized countries developing nations. We also might say that they are um, underdeveloped or less developed. The LDC means least developed countries, and NDC might mean newly developed countries. And then this is also sort of what we're talking about when we say first world versus third world. But in this class, we're really going to focus on calling these industrialized and non-industrialized because a lot of these terms are actually a little bit ethnocentric. When we say that a nation is underdeveloped, what we're saying is that they should strive to be industrialized. They should strive to be like us. And there are certainly pros to being a industrialized nation, but there's also a lot of cons that we'll get into in a second. So, although some people might benefit from industrialization in their country, others might be hurt by it. I tend to prefer industrialized and non-industrialized because we're still getting at that difference and we're still being descriptive and we're still understanding the pros and cons of both without having it be sort of value laden in the same way as something like first world and third world. Right. So the more culturally relative way to say it is industrialized and non-industrialized. And I try to stay away from things like first world and third world. But as I was alluding to, we do have a lot of consequences of industrialization. It's not always the best option. Some might argue that we never should have gone this far. Maybe it would be better for us if we went back. And, it's not my job to say whether that's true or not, but it is interesting to think about. So, one of the main consequences of industrialization is environmental. As I already said, we see a ton of pollution. This is through things like factories. In these pictures back here, we see all of this smoke and smog and pollution coming out. This was back when they burned coal, so it was terrible for the environment. But even driving through somewhere like, I don't know, over that one bridge on like 75. Um, I completely forgot what it's called. I'm sorry. I thought I was about to give a good example. I had never seen something like this before, right? With all of the smokestacks and all of those factories and they're producing stuff, and you see all of the kind of waste going into the environment as we burn fuel in order to do our production and manufacturing. So there is a lot of pollution associated with production and the actual industry of industrialization. But of course, the things that we make aren't just going to stay where we make them, or it wouldn't be worth it to make so many, right? The whole point of making this many is so that we can export them. So to get them to the other place, we have to ship them somewhere. And this is also a huge polluter to our environment, is the, planes, the ships, all of these different ways that we move our materials after creating them. And this is a huge contributor to global warming. Through greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the use of finite resources, so things like trees and coal. Anything that takes longer than a human life to reproduce is considered a finite resource. So because trees take a pretty long time to grow to a size that we can use it as fuel, they are considered a finite resource. And we use a lot of these finite resources up in the industrialization process. We also see a lot of social consequences of industrialization. So the first one that I want to talk about is the separation of capital and labor. So again, in this class, when we're talking about capital, sometimes we mean something like social capital, where it's immaterial and it's the things that you know that are able to demonstrate who you are. But capital can also just straight up mean money, right? And in this case, we are talking about money. In the past, labor was compensated relatively directly in trade for whatever was produced by the labor. So you make a thing, and that thing is worth money, and you get the money, right? But with industrialization, we tend to be more steps removed from the end product, right? We have things like the assembly line, multiple people helping make the thing. We are mass producing stuff. So we saw a shift into being paid not for what we produce, but instead for our time. This is our hourly wage. So because everybody needs a job and everybody has the same number of hours in a day, this results in less pay. And the company's success only really benefits those at the top because that hourly pay doesn't really have to change with production levels and success. So if your business takes off, let's say we're manufacturing cups, and the cup market is going crazy. We're selling a ton of like Stanleys or whatever. Um, the people at the top are going to make more money with that success, but the people who are only getting paid an hourly wage don't necessarily get a raise as the company starts doing better. So this separation of capital and labor has real consequences for the working class and for the proletariat, as we have also referred to it as in this class. We also see inequality being exacerbated by industrialization. So this pay difference contributes to things like class. If we have the people at the top, the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, um, making more money as the company gets more successful, but the people who are working, the proletariat, the working class, blue collar folks, not necessarily getting more money as the company does better and only getting paid for their time, then we start to see that divide widen between the classes and how much money they're making. And that contributes to this hierarchy where in our society, money is power. So some people have more power than others simply based off of this structure. But we also see people being put into really dangerous positions, specifically people in marginalized communities. So let me try to move out of the way. Oh man, this is okay. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So we have things like sweatshops, dangerous machines, stuff like that. So that was the other thing that I wanted to talk about with those pictures that I had back here. You'll notice women in these pictures. So this is back in the olden days, right? Women always wore these huge dresses. And the people that they wanted working with these machines with all of these little parts were actually women and children because we have these tiny little nimble fingers that men don't have. Like today, one of the biggest problems that men have with their fingers is texting, right? The tiny buttons. It's a lot more difficult for them. But imagine the number one job is working with machines and needing these little fingers to get into those spaces. That might be awesome for being able to get a job. However, this was incredibly dangerous because these machines were not made safe at all, and there were not worker protections on them. They didn't even have child labor laws yet. So a lot of people would kind of get their hands mangled, specifically women and children, because they were the ones being funneled into these jobs. And then also because of the sort of clothes they were expected to wear socially and culturally, these big long dresses often got caught in machines, and some women actually died from just sort of getting like sucked into a machine. So it's not always great to be the best fitted for the position if the position is really dangerous. I also wanted to recognize Detroit's relationship to industrialization. This is an industrial city. This is how Detroit grew so big was the auto industry. When we talk about things like the assembly line, they were basically born in Detroit. And if you haven't been to the DIA, I definitely recommend it. If you're able to show like a piece of mail or something that shows that you live in the area, I don't remember what counties it is, but at least Wayne County, you get in for free. There's probably also a student discount if you don't have that. But there's a really, really famous mural at the DIA called sorry, it's mirrored. The Detroit Industry Murals. They are from 1932 to 1933. And they were painted by Diego Rivera with the help of Frida Kahlo. So if you're not very informed about art and everything, Frida Kahlo is the woman that you will see in like paintings or drawings sometimes with the unibrow. That's Frida Kahlo, super, super famous artist. And then Diego Rivera, who I believe she was married to, also was a super famous artist. They're both from South America and they got commissioned to come all the way up to Detroit in the 30s to do these gigantic murals in the DIA. And these murals are about industrialization, and you can see a lot of really interesting symbolism about the things that I've been talking about with inequality and pollution and use of these finite resources, right? And you can do a really interesting deep dive on this mural if you're interested, but there's some specific people in the murals as well. You'll notice most of them don't really have clear faces, but then every once in a while there's somebody like this man right here, kind of to the right of my face, who their face is very clear. And some of those individuals are real people. So this man in particular, I believe is Japanese American. I don't remember his name or who exactly he is. But him and his presence really speak to the relationship that Detroit had with Japanese internment, in a similar period. Another really interesting fun fact about this mural that I heard was that the entire time that they were painting it, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo actually slept on the floor of the DIA. And the reason for that is because the DIA or the city of Detroit or whatever tried to put them up in a local hotel, right? These are big artists that they're commissioning to be here for a long time to do a very fancy, very expensive mural. Of course, they got them a hotel room. and they went to that hotel and they found out that that hotel wouldn't accept Jewish people to stay there. They were anti-Semitic and they would not work with Jews. So Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo said, "Hell no, we don't want any part in that. We're not supporting your business." And they opted to sleep on the floor in the DIA. So unrelated to the class, but just, I like to share my fun facts. Next, we need to talk about globalization. So, globalization is the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. So, for example, this might be shipping your products overseas, or it might be something like getting your parts or ingredients from other places. Most of the things that we have today are ingredients or pieces that make it up are not just from one place, right? So even my coffee that I made this morning, I make a latte every morning because why not? And in that latte, I had my coffee grounds were, I believe, from South America. I had some like little like sugary syrups that I put in it. The sugar was probably from the Caribbean. The other flavors in it might have been from other places. My milk was from the United States. And all of those came together to make my latte this morning from all of these different parts of the world that I was able to enjoy easily and for extremely cheap because I made it at home. But really, these things don't come from home, right? And the same can be said about basically everything else that we have because we have such a globalized industrial economy these days. Many different places around the world specialize on certain products, and then we're able to trade them so that we can each have them for cheaper. Right? If I go out and I buy googly eyes for wholesale, I can get them for really cheap, right? But then I have so many googly eyes. How am I going to use all of these googly eyes? But then I come and talk to you and I find out that you got pipe cleaners in wholesale, right? And then that guy over there got glue wholesale. And we can say, wait a minute. I can't do anything with just my googly eyes. You can't do anything with just your pipe cleaners, and you can't do anything with just your glue. But we can all give each other a really good deal because we got this wholesale, right? We got it really, really cheap. So now we can give each other a third of it, and then we can all make little like pipe cleaner googly eye monsters or something, right? For way cheaper than if I had to get all three of those supplies on my own. It would have been much more expensive. So this idea of globalization is basically the same on a much larger scale, right? And one thing that I want to be clear about, that I think a lot of students get confused about in an anthropology class, is just because we're so connected today, just because we're globalized, not just in terms of the economy and our markets, but also in terms of things like social media, movies, uh, any other art or media, that doesn't mean that we're homogenized. So we don't just have one big culture these days, because we have uneven access to all of these things, right? So I'm much closer to everything in America. So I'm much more heavily influenced by American culture as opposed to Chinese culture, which is so far away. And there's all of these different barriers in place, to keep those from just completely melding, right? We're spatially so far away and historically so different that there's always going to be some sort of degree of separation. It would be incredibly hard to make all of the cultures around the world mold into one. So we are connected, but we are not homogenized. We are not all the same. And we also have a lot of different effects of globalization, just like industrialization. One of those is decreased cost, just like I was talking about with the googly eye monsters. But this is for both manufacturing products and sourcing labor costs. So this kind of gets back into the social costs of industrialization. Another one of those is things like sweatshops. One of the reasons why people are critical of products that come from a place like China is because there are not as strict of labor laws there, and we perceive there to be a lot more sweatshops, people who are not getting fairly paid for their work, things like that. But I also want to recognize that there's still sweatshops around today in the United States. So there are a lot of people whose labor is getting taken advantage of, and that's part of why it's important to be thoughtful about why the things you're purchasing are so inexpensive, and how those costs were cut. We'll get into that a little bit in our retail products and goods module as well. We also see an increased variety of goods. So, for example, I was talking about my coffee. I would not have been able to have all of those different items together in my coffee if I was restricted to only the things that can be produced in the Detroit area, right? I don't think that this environment is hospitable for growing cane sugar. So I might not have had the same sort of sweetener in my coffee. Or even, something like cows. This is a very industrial place. We don't really have a lot of fields anymore. So our milk does not actually come from Detroit usually. Most of our milk comes from California in the United States. Um, we also see increased consumption. So because we have this availability and this decreased cost, it makes it so that we can consume more things, we can have more things. And that's good and bad, right? We are able to have stuff, and having stuff is awesome. Like you guys probably saw in the beginning of the lecture, like I am like my apartment, I'm a trinkets girly, like I like to have stuff. If I'm in an empty room, I will go insane. So I am not one to tell you that you shouldn't have things, right? But sometimes this gets a little bit over the top, which we will also talk about in our retail products and goods module. This globalization also drives innovation. So we get a lot of new ideas through both competition and access to materials. Because I have access to these things that are primarily produced in India or in the Caribbean or South America or something like that, and I can combine them with the other objects that I have access to, I'm able to create more new things. But also, I'm in competition with people in, China, or in Canada, and I am feeling the pressure to create a better product, create a new product, make it cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. We also see economic specialization. So that is what this graphic is. We see every country's export by product, their top exports. So we can see in the United States, our top exports are things like cars and minerals. But then somewhere else, like, I don't know, we have, what is that, Kenya? Is that Kenya in Africa? I I'm really bad at geography, and I have a good excuse. We can get into that another time. But I kind of want to say that's Kenya. Their number one exports are minerals and plastics and rubbers. So we don't really produce much rubber where we're from, but we are able to interact with these other places that can trade rubber to us, right? And then we can trade things like cars to them. We also see economic interdependence. So because we are each producing only a certain subcategory of items and mass producing them, we need each other more. We need each other globally in order to have these things that are becoming more and more necessary in our modern globalized world. We also see lower pay as we have this competition, and this drive for the decreased costs, increased levels of industrialization, things like that. people are not making as much money as historically they might have. But some people are making a lot of money. We also have job displacement. So we hear a lot, especially around election times, about jobs going overseas and bringing jobs back home, things like that. This really often goes back to that search for decreased costs. So if you are trying to produce a product for as cheap as possible, you probably don't want to pay very much for labor. So it might look really good to pay less for the labor and outsource it overseas, right? So those jobs are no longer in the United States because they would have to pay them more if they were paying United States workers. Instead, those jobs are going to people overseas that they don't get paid as much. And then lastly, we have exploitation and inequality. This is kind of a result of a lot of these different things that I have been talking about, where we have all of this competition, all of this interdependence, and we don't tend to prioritize keeping everyone equal in this process. We are more so in competition than anything else. So somebody is going to end up getting stepped on. Um, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is alternative applications of capitalism. So here in the United States, we have that capitalist habitus, right? Capitalism seems like a very obvious choice. It seems very correct, both logically and morally to us as Americans a lot of the time. But I want to diversify our understanding of what capitalism is, because there's a lot of different ways to do capitalism. For example, China practices state capitalism while the United States practices market capitalism. State capitalism, like China has, is where the government controls businesses and commercial economic activities. So this would not be neoliberal, right? Because the number one thing that neoliberalism loves and needs is a free market without very much state intervention. Um, by contrast, we have market capitalism, which thrives on private ownership, which is that neoliberal structure. And the interesting thing about this is that even though we value capitalism so much and our free market and all of that, we technically don't practice pure capitalism. This is something that a lot of people get wrong on the first test. But America is not considered to be a capitalist economy. We are considered to have a mixed economy. Some examples of things that we do in the United States that are not purely capitalist are things like regulations on what businesses can do, taxes are not capitalist, and subsidizations are also not this pure market neoliberal capitalism structure. So, although we deeply, deeply value our neoliberal capitalism here in the United States. It's part of our habitus. It's so deeply ingrained in our society that it feels like common sense. We actually don't even really have a pure capitalist structure, which is crazy. And one way that we can see this that might start to make it make a little bit more sense is by comparing to other places. So the United States version of capitalism might not even be the most effective version of capitalism based on whatever your goal is. So there is something called the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, where they rank all of the different countries based off of economic freedom. I do want to preface this section that I am not an economist, right? That's not my training. I took like one class that had anything to do with the economy. I'm an anthropologist. So we are talking about culture here, but it does involve the economy because the economy is one of the facets of our culture. So this is a cultural process, and I can't pretend to understand all of the ins and outs of different economies and their structures, but I can speak on economies from a cultural standpoint. And the interesting thing about the heritage of economic freedom is that although we as the United States view being American as like synonymous with this idea of freedom, and we have this market economy where we want to have a free market, right? It's very neoliberal. We actually rank pretty low on the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom. Number one is Singapore. Their per capita GDP is 72K. Number two is Switzerland. Their per capita GDP is 88K. And then the United States is all the way down at number 25, at least at the time that I made this PowerPoint a few years ago, at 69K. So, by our own definition of capitalism and our own cultural understanding of what capitalism should be, Singapore and Switzerland actually do a much better job. Not only are they more free in terms of what's measured in the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, but their per capita GDP is also higher. You might be feeling curious about Singapore, so I have some little facts here about Singapore and their economy, and then we're going to watch a short video. Um, the per capita GDP is just a country's economic output average per person, so that's what that number is. That's a little bit lower. And by 1994, the per capita GDP in Singapore had surpassed Australia, Canada, and the United States. And by 2014, they actually had the third highest global GDP. They have state capitalism, just like China, so they operate under the theory that government intervention is required to maximize state product profit and public revenue, which means that the people in Singapore do not have control over the means of production. The Singapore state owns 90% of the country's land. This is compared to the United States, which the government owns 29% of our land, which is actually more than I would have expected for some reason. And the government also owns large portions of a lot of companies in Singapore. This is really interesting because they still rank higher than us on the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, right? All of those things like state intervention sound like not freedom to us. They sound like the antithesis of freedom, but they still rank much, much higher than us, and they have a higher per capita GDP. And it might be considered a more pure form of capitalism to many. Part of why Singapore might be okay with this state capitalism structure as opposed to our market capitalism structure is a difference in cultural values. So again, in the United States, we value things like freedom, independence, ownership. So we want freedom to do whatever we want. We do not want the state or the government to be telling us what to do. We want to be completely independent in our choices and have that free market. However, in a lot of these Asian countries, including Singapore, there is a lot less emphasis on freedom and independence, and a lot more emphasis on interdependence and relying on one another and something more along the lines of teamwork. So let's go ahead and watch the video really quick, and then we will come back. Next, in Switzerland, the really interesting thing about this one for me is that the middle class holds 70% of the wealth in the United States. This is compared to the United States, where the richest 1% of people owns 40% of the wealth. So again, in Switzerland, the middle class, so the average people, hold 70% of wealth. Whereas in the United States, the top 1%, so only less than half of one person in our whole class owns 40%, so almost half of the wealth. So the wealth is a lot more distributed in Switzerland, yet their per capita GDP is still higher than ours, right? In the United States, the richest 1% of Americans own 40% of the country's wealth, while a larger share of working age people, 18 through 65, live in poverty than any other nation belonging to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. That's a quote from the New York Times. We also see a really high immigrant population in Switzerland. They have 38% immigrants, whereas the United States only has 14%. This is really interesting, again, culturally, when we consider the context of some of our political debates that we have extremely frequently here in the United States, pertaining to availability of jobs and immigrants, coming in and taking our jobs and stuff like that. However, we have significantly less than half of the immigrants that Switzerland has, percentage-wise, ratio-wise, and yet they seem to be distributing wealth better than us, and they also have a higher GDP. Switzerland is also known for having good public schooling and affordable college. This is probably, and the rest of this is probably because they emphasize social equality a lot more than the United States. Here we have that assumption that equality isn't necessarily possible under the United States. We have that belief that it is human nature to stockpile wealth, and we should be looking out for ourselves rather than each other. But they don't necessarily have that belief in Switzerland, right? Our economy was built on slavery, and that was the origin of a lot of our wealth, a lot of our opportunity, and a lot of our inequality. So from the jump, the United States has kind of been built on inequality in order to attain wealth, whereas other cultures may have centered things like equality a little bit more. So I just thought that Switzerland and Singapore were both really interesting examples of how we can do capitalism so differently and how that might relate to our cultural differences and how we see trade-offs in relation to that. In contrast, I wanted to talk a little bit about communism and socialism. Communism is where the state owns and controls property and economic resources. So, for example, this would be places like Cuba or North Korea. And socialism is where the state equally distributes economic resources to its citizens. So, for example, India and Portugal. Usually these places are going to have lower per capita GDPs. However, using that to dunk on a communist or socialist country is not very reasonable when we're thinking culturally relatively, because there isn't as much of a cultural emphasis on things like profit and wealth. Therefore, per capita GDP would not be a good measurement of success from the viewpoint of a country with these beliefs. I have another video that I wanted to show you guys on this topic. It's 16 minutes long, so that's going to kind of close out our lecture. It's incredibly clear what the guy in the video's thoughts are and what he is arguing for. That is not necessarily the argument that we are making in this class. Rather, we are exposing ourselves to different mindsets in order to understand them and, again, exercise that anthropological, culturally relativistic way of thinking. So you by no means have to agree with the guy in the video. What he says you can think is BS. It can irritate you. That's totally fine. But what I do want you to make sure you consider is things like cultural relativism and how cultural values relate to a country's economic structures. So why does socialism make sense to some places and capitalism makes sense to others? I also want you to pay attention to how this video helps us review things like capitalism and the Protestant work ethic. Okie dokie. That brings me to the end of the lecture. Before next time, which is our last lecture before our first test, you have one reading due. Okay. You need to read The Economics of Chat GPT. This is a more quantitative article, and you don't need to read every word. It's pretty lengthy. You just need to get the main ideas of what it's talking about so that you can follow in the lecture. We also have an optional document that goes with it. If you're curious, you can go through it, but you don't need to go through that. We are going to talk about it in class, and I figured some of you might appreciate having the link to it. And then test one review day is going to be the 20th. I have a Google form where you can send in any questions that you have about the test. Again, that class period, we go over a huge portion of the test questions. So it's really important to be there. And it's really important to ask questions based off of the study guide and the things that you might not be so sure about in the study guide, because the questions that you ask are what my review depends on. So I'm not just going to go through and tell you all the answers to the test. I'm going to see what you want to talk about, and I am going to cater my answers to the test. So be sure that you come in on that day ready to ask questions. Be sure you send in questions on that Google form, especially if you're a little bit shy and want to send them in anonymously. Those are the questions that I'm going to prioritize. So even if you're not shy, make sure that you send any burning questions in. We are also going to have reflection 2 due on the 22nd. That won't open up until after we go through next class period because, again, I want you to have all of the information necessary in order to answer the prompt. Okie dokie, that is the end of today's lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that this was helpful for you exercising that anthropological way of thinking, and I hope that it broadened your global perspective a little bit. That's what makes this class a Gen Ed, is because we talk about other places other than the United States sometimes. So I will see you on Tuesday, hopefully. Have a wonderful Valentine's Day. Oh, and make sure that you come to my basketball team's bake sale on the 18th in Old Main. Have a good weekend and Valentine's Day.